Today we're going to resolve some domestic issues by replacing this clunky kitchen table with a custom fit trestle table.
Hit it!
When we first moved into this house, we really liked this built-in bench that was here, and it's sort of a eat-in kitchen area. We didn't have a table that would fit here. The gaming dining table is in the dining room, and it would have been too big for this location anyway. So we got this table from a neighbor for free, and it has served the purpose. But the problem is the legs are always hitting the bench, and we usually have Mateo over here. We've got Ava in the high chair. Nicole sits where I'm sitting, and it actually makes it really difficult to get in and out of here without pushing the table too far away from the kids. The overhang just isn't enough here. So we need to design a table that is sized appropriately for this space, but also gives us the leg room. Because look, I can't actually get my legs in without pushing the table further out. So a trestle table is perfect for this. And with a substantial overhang, we'll be able to pull it this way and still have room to get your legs in and out. Additionally, if we have some kind of curves in our top, we can make it easier to not hit your hip on a corner if a parent is trying to get out of this space to go into the kitchen to get some yogurt bites or whatever the heck these kids are eating these days. All right, so let's head into the shop and I'll show you what we made. Well, here's the design I came up with. It's a pretty straightforward trestle table with a little spag flare added to it. I tried to do everything that I needed for that space, so the leg spacing is appropriate. The top and the shape of the top with some curves on the edges really helps people get in and out of that built-in bench there. We've got some cool details with through wedged mortise and tenon joints, walnut accents, and a little bit of texturing, which is going to be a fun thing that I'll show you how to do a little bit later. Now, as far as the tools go for this, I used a lot of different things because a lot of times it's, not that I'm indecisive, but I like to show you different ways to get the job done and some of the cool tools that are out there that may make that easier and faster for you. But also it's fun to do things the old school way sometimes, or with power tools and hand tools, the hybrid way, if you will. So let's get into the build. It's going to be a fun one. I'll start with the base first. With all the boards laid out, I can strategically select the best grain. For instance, this section here is perfect for the 2 feet. Ripping this board down the middle will yield grain that follows the tapers. I'll mark all the parts oversized at this stage. I'll use the bandsaw to rip the parts to rough width. Since the wood is in a rough state, the bandsaw is much safer than a table saw. I'll then trim the boards to rough length at the miter saw. The pieces are then jointed on one face and one edge. At the planer, I'll bring the pieces to final thickness. Refer to the cut list since some base parts are thicker than others. While not essential, the drum sander saves me a lot of time by removing the milling marks and smoothing the surface. Now the pieces can be ripped to final width at the table saw. Notice that I'm also being strategic about these cuts, trying to remove as much of the lighter colored sapwood as possible. And don't forget to mill up the walnut accent strips while you're at it. Each leg assembly consists of 2 pieces of cherry with a walnut strip that sits proud of the outside surface. With the bottoms flush, I measure for the mortise. It's located 14 1/4 up from the bottom, but I give myself some breathing room by putting the mark just a hair over. I then measure up from there 3 3/4 inch. Now we have our cut lines that will create the mortises in the walnut strips. Before taking the boards out of the clamps, I'll mark a few reference lines for dominoes. This isn't totally necessary, but it helps me lock these pieces in their current position during the final glue up. You could use biscuits here or skip this step altogether and just be careful about your alignment. Because I want my walnut strips to have some wiggle room, I'll use the slightly wider setting for the walnut mortises. At the miter saw, I cut my walnut strips on the lines that I marked previously. The outside of the cherry boards will be much harder to sand smooth after the glue up, thanks to the strip of walnut that sits proud, so I'll sand those up to 220 grit right now. The glue up should be pretty uneventful for two reasons. We use the dominoes to help with alignment so that we don't have to worry about the parts slipping past one another, and second, I cut a small 3 3/4 inch long block that will serve as a spacer for our mortise opening. This should ensure that both of my mortises are exactly the same size. Avoid getting glue into the mortise area if you can. And notice, I'm not even putting glue on the dominoes. The long grain glue bond is plenty strong here, so the dominoes are just there to help with alignment. After the glue is dry, we can pop out the spacer and use it for the second leg glue up. And that, my friends, is the easiest perfect mortise you'll ever make. Now we can sand the flat inside surface to remove any glue squeeze out. On the outside, I'll use a chisel and a scraper to get rid of the dried glue. To cut to final length, I'll measure 14 1/4 down from the bottom of the mortise and 6 1/4 up from the top of the mortise. We're going to use loose tenon joinery for the top and bottom of our legs. I lay the mortises out using a center line for reference, and the dimensions are listed in the plan. Now to cut our mortises, I'm going to use a handheld router with an edge guide and a 1/2 inch spiral bit. And cutting on end grain is a little bit tricky, and the fact that we've got this very narrow edge to balance our router, it could be a little bit problematic if we don't think ahead. So what I've done is milled up a piece of scrap that is nice and square, provides a nice bit of extra support, and if I clamp that to my workpiece and then set up for the routing, I should be able to safely get this job done. But we're going to do it in 3 steps using the turret stops on the router, so this way we don't take off that entire 3/4 inch deep bite at once. That would be kind of scary in end grain. All right, so we'll work our way down. Take your time and focus on keeping the router balanced. That looks pretty good. The top mortises are routed the same way. Now let's add the taper to the legs. We'll stay full width at the bottom and connect that to a mark that's 3/4 of an inch in at the top. You could certainly use a tapering jig at the table saw, but for a one-off project like this, the bandsaw works just fine. Clean up the edges at the joiner or using a hand plane. The feet and main outer cleats are the same length, so I'll cut them down with the crosscut sled and the fence as a stop. Now we can make the mortises in our feet and outer cleats. I line up the leg center line with a center line on the foot, and then simply transfer the mortise marks. Now we can easily transfer those marks to the other foot. Repeat this marking process for the outer cleats and the top of the leg. Routing these mortises will be a little easier since we're not dealing with end grain, and by clamping the 2 feet together, we have a built-in router support. Just like the legs, the feet and outer cleats receive tapers. We'll finish off the feet and supports with a small roundover. Keep in mind that the top of the outer cleats should not receive a roundover since that's where it meets the tabletop. I'll put the same roundover on the side of the legs. And now for a little cleanup sanding. Now, before we get into the tenons and gluing this thing together, I'm gonna do a little magic trick. I'm gonna divide the audience in half. I think half of you will love this idea, the other half will hate it. And that's okay, because honestly, I think if everybody loves what you do across the board, you're probably not trying very hard to do things differently or in a unique way. So years ago, on a Krenov display stand that I built, on the inside of the handle here, I did a dimpling technique that gave it this sort of hand-hammered, almost very textured, organic sort of look. And it really does set off a surface if you have the contrast of smooth and rough. And I think here we've got a great opportunity for that because the cherry's nice and smooth and consistent, and this walnut strip is just kind of there. Okay, we could just soften the edges and leave it as is. I think that would be fine, but I think it's going to look much more interesting if we actually give it some texture. So I'm going to use a die grinder and this little cutting burr on here. It's kind of an oval shape, and you just sort of drop it onto the edge and make what seems like a random pattern. Now this took me a long time just to do this little tiny piece here, so I'm going to be here for a while, but it's fun and it's a very cool thing, and hopefully you'll like it. And most importantly, Nicole said I could do it, so it's her table. The only difficult thing about this process is trying to make a random pattern. I think humans naturally want to find patterns in things, and when we try to be random, it's usually anything but. So to get as close as I can to random, I just continually tap the burr onto the surface, moving through various paths across the strip. Then I just look for flat areas and dimple as needed. It's looking pretty cool. Now our top support pieces here need to have 4 holes so that we can attach it to the underside of the tabletop. And of course tabletops are going to expand and contract over their width, right? So we need to allow for that. So when I attach my screws, the center holes have just a little bit of movement. You don't really need a whole lot there. Where you need the extra movement is toward the outside, and that actually has a double slotted hole essentially, so it's got a lot more wiggle room here, and that's gonna allow that top to expand and contract. So let me show you how I made it and we'll get into the assembly. We'll start by cutting a 3/4 inch diameter recess with a Forstner bit. Each support gets 2 inner holes and 2 outer holes. By the way, because of the taper angle, you really want to use a drill press for this operation. Now, using a 1/4 inch bit, I'll go back to the inner holes and drill straight through. For the outer holes, I'll drill to the left and to the right of the center point to create a slot, which will allow for movement. Now let's use some cutoffs to make our tenon stock. We only need 4 of each size. I'll plane the stock down to a 1/2 inch thick using my mortises to get the fit just right. At the router table, I'll round the edges over so that they'll fit our mortises perfectly. Because the fit is so snug and air could get trapped in the mortise, I'm cutting very shallow grooves on both faces of the tenons. Now, I'll cut the tenons to final length. Sand the edges to remove the frayed material that should make it a little bit easier to insert them into the mortises. Now, let's glue these babies up. Once the glue skin's over, I like to use a chisel to clean up the squeeze out. So now we're getting into what is easily the trickiest part of this project, and that's the connection of the rail to our leg. So of course we have our pre-made mortise here, that's already done, but we have to make our tenons on the end of the rails, make that fit perfectly through here, and then once the tenon goes through, there's a mortise on the tenon itself, and that allows our wedges to go in and hold this whole thing together. So kind of tricky, tedious, but a lot of fun. Let's get into it. First, let's scribe the shoulder. This gives us a visual line and helps prevent tear out. Following the dimensions in the plan, I'll draw the tenon layout. The tenons will be cut with a 3/4 inch dado stack, and I'll use my dado crosscut sled to hold the rail. A piece of scrap supports the overhanging rail, and the fence serves as a stop. I'll make a conservative cut on each face and test the fit against the mortise. It should be too big, so now we can raise the blade slightly and sneak up on the fit. Keep in mind, if your dado leaves a rough cut, you might consider leaving the tenons slightly oversized and cleaning them up with a hand plane, something we'll talk more about later. Now that's what we're looking for. I'll adjust the fence to make the cut right on the shoulder line. Once both ends of the rails have their shoulders cut, I can move the fence and begin hogging away the rest of the stock. The bottom of the tenon actually has a 1/2 inch shoulder, so I'll raise the blade and clear that material away. We'll test the fit first. That's a bit tight. There we go. Don't try to hit the shoulder perfectly here. We'll clean it up with a chisel next. Just pare the proud material away and make it even with the surrounding shoulder. The shoulder isn't absolutely perfect when I check it with a square, so let's tune it up. A shoulder plane allows me to take light passes on the narrow ledge, bringing all 4 shoulders into agreement. When planing end grain, it's pretty easy to accidentally chip out the edge. Usually you can just drop in some CA glue and set it back in place for a flawless repair. So how about a little dry assembly? The tenons receive a large mortise for our wedges, and we'll use the dry assembly to start the layout. Using a fine pencil, I mark a line where the tenon meets the leg. The rest of the layout is done according to the plan. The mortise can really be any size you want. The only thing you really need to do is recess the mortise slightly. So we'll push the line back by about a 1/16 of an inch. Now here's why. If we start with the mortise flush with the legs and the wood decides to expand, we could end up with a situation where the mortise wall sits proud of the legs, and that renders the wedges useless. But if we recess the mortise slightly, we can ensure that the wedges are always applying pressure to the legs. To save wear and tear on the router bit, I'll hog out the material with a Forstner bit first. We could get crazy with a fancy jig here, but I'm going to keep it simple and use a small flush trim pattern bit. Using a few dabs of CA glue, I'll stick some 1/4 inch veneered MDF scrap to the tenon right on my pencil line. I'll use a second piece on the underside of the tenon to help prevent tear out, and a third piece to establish the other side of the mortise. The bearing will now ride against the MDF to establish the walls of the mortise. At the ends, we'll just stop before we hit the line. Now, this is a low visibility situation here, so take your time and work your way clockwise around the opening. My bit isn't long enough to go through in one shot, so I'll lower the bit, and now the bearing will reference off of the mortise wall itself. Now we just need to clean up the corners using a chisel. Work your way down, trying to keep the chisel as straight as possible. Pop off the guides and flip the rail over to work from the other side. Alright, so I've done another dry assembly. Everything looks pretty good, but I do have a pretty big decision to make at this point. Now these glue spots are really no problem. We could just sand or scrape those away, but I'm actually concerned about these grooves. Now I used a dado stack I don't normally use, so I wasn't expecting it to cut so deep. And these grooves are usually helpful for severing the grain, but if you're gonna expose the surface that you cut, you're gonna wind up having all these grooves all over the place. So I could just sand it down, scrape it, do something to thin it out a little bit and get rid of those. That's not ideal because it changes the geometry of this piece. What I'm gonna do instead is a creative solution to this. I'm going to take this dimpling effect and bring it into the tenon. And by dimpling it, I could clean all of that up and carry this textured look through into the tenon and then back down into the walnut strip. So kind of a risky thing because I'm not 100% sure it's going to look good, but we're going to give it a shot. I'm tracing around the perimeter to show me how far to take the dimpling. Dimples inside the leg mortise won't look very good. This process is just like before, only we're texturing all sides of the tenon, and I have to make sure I go deep enough to remove those grooves. All right, well, to be honest, I don't love it and I don't hate it. You know, if I really didn't like it, I would just say, scrap it, let's get a new rail and start over again. But I did solve a problem with this. It allows me to continue using this workpiece. I even showed it to Nicole to see what she thought. And while it may be a little bit too much of this texturing, it's not that bad, you know, and ultimately it's going to be under a tabletop in a shadow that you're only going to notice if you get down on your knees and take a very close look at it. So we're going to keep it as is, you know, but this could be an example of how you have a cool idea, and sometimes with design, you don't really know how much of it to do until you take it too far. And whether it's the size of parts, something being too small or too big, and you find the middle point, this could be one of those things where, yeah, this was acceptable, but maybe this is a little bit too much. You know, but it's not so far out there that I would say let's scrap this piece and start over again. So we will push forward and keep it as is. Next time, we'll make the inner braces, the wedges, the tabletop, and apply the finish.